Hi, all. We're talking about settler indigenous treaties this week. And as it happens, settler indigenous treaties are in the news this week. If you've been following the news at all, you've seen stories coming out of Nova Scotia about disputes between lobster fishermen in St. Mary's Bay and indigenous fishers who are trying to practice in the fishery, in the lobster fishery in particular, with claim based in the 1752 Treaty of Halifax, which just precedes the Seven Years' War, as we were discussing 2 weeks ago. So it's very much a part of the story that we're looking at and directly comes out of that. And it involves a treaty that was long ignored, but as I mentioned in your lecture, increasingly treaties are being examined by Canadian courts, and increasingly they're not being ignored. And that's really, really important because it means that they're trying to treat the treaties seriously and figure out what the legal standing of them actually is and what it actually means. There's been a series of really important legal cases, Supreme Court cases in particular, in Canada in the past 30 years or so. There's two or three that we could point to in particular as being very important, but one of them is this one, the Marshall decision by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999. That's 21 years ago. So we're not in the 18th century anymore. We're 20 years ago. It involves this man, Donald Marshall Jr., who is a Mi'kmaq fisher who was arrested for illegally catching eels. He was catching eels out of the recognized provincial season for an eel fishery. And he claimed he was doing so by exercising his treaty rights, and he pointed to the 1752 treaty in particular. Donald Marshall was not the first person to ever do this. In fact, there's a series of people doing this going back until the early 19th century. So, for almost 200 years, people have been making this claim, but the courts were ignoring it. A number of courts in Nova Scotia, and then eventually in federal court in Canada, and then eventually the Supreme Court of Canada, began to point out that this treaty still seemed to have standing, and it did actually seem to indicate that there was a right given to the Mi'kmaq at the time to continue to fish. And what the Supreme Court argued was, and this is the key phrase that they came up with, was that the Mi'kmaq seemed to have been promised in the treaty the ability to obtain a moderate livelihood. That's a really vague phrase. It seems to suggest something particular like a livelihood, something, but this moderate and what exactly that means is really controversial, and therefore it's been subject to negotiations. Except we're 21 years later, and that's really what the story in Nova Scotia this week is all about, or this month is all about. It's just trying to figure out what exactly that means and how you can regulate and define that fishery in the 21st century. Lots of people have weighed in on this. This just came out yesterday. This is a group of lawyers in Ontario and Nova Scotia who specialize in Indigenous law, and they've published a paper in this journal, Policy Options, and the title says that all First Nations have their own legal authority to regulate their fishing rights. And there's a photo there in the background of a demonstration taking place in Nova Scotia just last week about this very issue. So people are weighing in on this, and they're trying to shape the story in particular ways. And we don't necessarily need to get into the particulars of the legal decision, because that in itself is very, very complex. But we do have an opportunity here to quickly look at the historical background of this so that you can have some sense of what's going on here. We know, and we talked about this in our very first lecture, that the Mi'kmaq are a maritime people. And again, I stressed at the time, not capital M maritime, they're not from the Maritimes, but maritime in the sense that they are sea-based people. They're people whose livelihoods principally came from the sea. This is a scraping done with pencil over paper of rock etchings from central Nova Scotia, a place called Kejimkujik in central southwestern Nova Scotia. And this was thought to have been done sometime around 1000 or 1200 AD. I mean, they're very ancient rock carvings. And it shows two men in a canoe, and they seem to be hunting porpoises. The fish seems to be out of the water. Porpoises jump out of the water. And he seems to be throwing a spear at the porpoise as an indication of just, I mean, I don't think you needed a drawing to prove this, but it is certainly a recognizable moment and an indication of these people as maritime people and as a sea-based people. Oops, I went the wrong way there. And Here's another illustration from the 19th century, a painting of a Mi'kmaq encampment done around 1810, which shows the Mi'kmaq family coming in off their canoe. You see the man carrying a gun, the woman carrying fish, baby on her back. She's doing it all. But again, this is this kind of typical pattern for Indigenous people, and the sea being a critical part of their livelihoods. And this continues into the present. This isn't the present. This is from the 1960s. But it's a photograph of a weir constructed along an estuary where a river meets the sea. And it's a trap. You can see there's a gateway there that fish are encouraged to swim into, and that once they get into the circular part there, they're trapped. And so you can catch, this one was used for catching salmon and eels at different times of the year. And again, it just kind of points to a kind of continued exercising and practices of sustainable sustenance through fishing activities that have been practiced by the Mi'kmaq for an awfully long time. So what's this got to do with what we're talking about? Well, it has a lot to do with it. We looked at the 7 Years' War, we looked at the relationship between the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians, and unfortunately the story in Nova Scotia in the past few weeks shows a serious deterioration between relations between those Acadians and the Mi'kmaq in that area, that's for sure. But this is in that period where Britain controls the mainland, but they haven't really conquered all of what was once known as Acadia, but has become since known as Nova Scotia. But in the process of that story, the British try to negotiate peaceful relations with the Mi'kmaq, because the Mi'kmaq are French allies. And so the British are looking for ways to do this. And they do sign a series of treaties over the course of that half century, where Nova Scotia is kind of contested territory. Between 1725, which is the treaty you're looking at in class this week, and 1752, and there's subsequent ones as well, but the one that's most frequently pointed to is this one. It's the most extensive and most clear, I think, of all the treaties in this period. The Treaty of Halifax in 1752. This is the one that the Mi'kmaq and the Supreme Court have pointed to consistently as offering the clearest definition of that relationship. What I want you to see is the basic title of this treaty. And this is from the proclamation issued by the government in Halifax, by the governor in Halifax, in the fall of 1752. And it says a proclamation, whereas the treaty or articles of peace and friendship hath been renewed on the 22nd between the governor and Major Jean-Baptiste Cope, chief Sachem of the Chibinacady, that's Shubenacadie tribe of Micmac, Mi'kmaq, inhabited the eastern coast of this province. So it's an announcement of that peace treaty. Let's look really quickly. Whoa, that went to the wrong place. Why did that go wrong? Here we go. Went to the right place now. Here's the actual treaty. Sorry, it's not the actual treaty. It's a transcript of the actual treaty. The proclamation is right here, but this is a transcript, and it's certainly going to be easier for us to read. So that's what it is, Articles of Peace and Friendship, outlined there, with Jean-Baptiste Cope, the Mi'kmaq representative, agreed the Articles of Submission and Agreement, which is what you're reading this week, from 1725, the exact version that you're reading this week. So here they're being, as it says, they do make and renew the same solemn promises and strict observances and so on. So they're talking about things that took place during the war in the past few years, and they're going to be buried in oblivion with the hatchet. So the war is over. And it's interesting that they're using a Mi'kmaq or indigenous metaphor there. And it's an indication of a kind of translation going on there, that they clearly understand the terms that each other is using. They're going to encourage them, Article number 3, that encourage the tribe to use their utmost endeavors to bring in other Indigenous people. So this is not all the Mi'kmaq. This is just a couple of leaders. And the Mi'kmaq exist in a very decentralized relationship with one another. So and the British understand that. And so they want Cope and the other signatories to bring in other Mi'kmaq people, Mi'kmaq leaders in particular, to sign this treaty. Here's where we get into this week, though. This is Article 4. It agreed that the said tribe of Indians shall not be hindered from, but have free liberty of hunting and fishing as usual. And if they shall think a truck house needful at the river Chibinacady or any other place of their resort, they shall have the same built and proper merchandise lodged therein. So the British are saying, we will become your customers. We will become the people who will trade with you. We will come up with trade goods that we will engage in trade with you. And it continues to talk about that until this is built, and of course it's never built, but until this is built, they shall have free liberty to bring for sale to Halifax or any other settlement in the province skins, feathers, fowl, fish, or any other thing that they shall have to sell. That sounds like lobster to me, but I don't want to get into the decision yet. They'll also have a quantity of bread and flour in the meantime, proportionate to the number of said Indians, shall be given them half yearly from time to time, and it shall regard to be had to the other tribes that shall thereafter agree to renew and ratify the peace upon the terms and conditions now stipulated. So they're offering a broad compensation for the losses. They shall reiterate these terms every year on the 1st of October yearly, so long as they shall continue in this peace and friendship. And at that point, they shall receive presents of blankets, tobaccos, and some powder and shot. And that the said Indians promise once every year upon the 1st of October to come by themselves or their delegates and receive the said presents and renew the friendships and submissions. In other words, to renew the treaty and to renew the sense of friendship between the two groups. And then there's a bunch of other terms about disputes and that the Mi'kmaq will attempt to rescue people shipwrecked along the coast and details, things like that, which are interesting but not necessarily important to what we're looking at right here. So that goes directly to that treaty. That goes directly to what that treaty is all about, and it shows some idea of what was understood at the time and how the courts have tried to interpret that since then. So that's how the Mi'kmaq have interpreted, and they continue to honor Treaty Day to this day on October 1st, the day of the signing of the 1752 treaty. They continue to come to Halifax as stipulated in the treaty and to recognize that they continue to honor the treaty. And of course, the point in doing so is to say, you're not. The province of Nova Scotia, you are not fulfilling your obligations under this treaty, and why aren't you? So it's a political move, obviously, but it's an honoring of the treaty. It's a respect for the treaty. It's a respect for the terms of the treaty. And to go back to the fishery question, the key point there is that capacity, that they would have continued capacity to fish, to hunt, and to feed themselves as much as possible. And that's where that term moderate livelihood probably came from. The Supreme Court was not very good at clearly defining that term, and the federal and provincial governments have been lousy at trying to interpret it and come up with a framework that would be usable for ongoing negotiations and future discussions, but they haven't done that. And so that's why the Mi'kmaq are in this day taking boats into the water and forcing the issue, forcing the federal government to come up with some kind of arrangement here. But of course, this is angering fishermen. This is angering settler fishermen who are saying, no, we live in a heavily regulated world. We can't go at any time. We can't fish anytime. You need to follow those rules as well. And you need to have a proper license from the federal government like we have. So they're trying to push for equity. They're trying to push for everybody having the same rules and regulations. And the Mi'kmaq are saying, well, this treaty gives us our own rules and regulations. And until we can find a way to find some sort of balance, we're going to try to exercise that right. And that's, I'm sure if I had an expert here in this area, we could quibble over the terms, but that's the basic issue here. Who's going to regulate this? What are the numbers going to be? How much of a right is there? What does this moderate livelihood mean? Does this mean they can run the entire fishery? Does this mean they can run a part of the fishery? Does this mean something proportionate to their population? All those kinds of things might make some sort of sense in some sort of context, but because the Supreme Court and the federal government haven't really clearly defined those terminologies, we still need to work all that stuff out. So you might think, well, that's just lobsters off Nova Scotia. What the hell? The point is that this general principle applies across the country. We go now to the Royal Proclamation, another one of the documents you're reading this week. Look at that big swath of territory, lands reserved for the Indians. This is a map representing troop positions in British North America at the time. You see them from Halifax and Boston and New York and down into Virginia. But what's also indicated very clearly there is that principle of the Royal Proclamation, that all that land west of the Appalachian Mountains is reserved for the Indians. And the Royal Proclamation, as you're reading this week, outlines specific terms for its removal from Indian control, from indigenous control. So what does that mean? Well, it means treaties. And in some places, treaties have been signed, and in some places they haven't. In Southern Ontario, there have been treaties signed, and some of them do appear to be fairly clear that they are land surrender treaties. Other ones aren't so, and the specific terms of those treaties are not clear either. So again, those are subject to ongoing negotiations. This map does not take us as far west as British Columbia. But the British Empire understood, the government of the British Empire understood the Royal Proclamation to extend all the way across North America. So when we get to British Columbia, there's no treaties whatsoever. Nova Scotia, they're peace and friendship treaties, not land surrender treaties. In British Columbia, there's no treaties at all. Well, there's a couple, but they only cover small pieces of land, nothing like the vast expanse of British Columbia. So again, these are ongoing current issues, issues that need to be sorted by us, that need to be sorted by you as future citizens of this country. These are critical questions, and they're historic questions. They're rooted in our past, and the past continues to live with us. It continues to leave legacies for us, things that we must deal with.